I'm Daniel Potts. I serve as senior pastor in Southeast Michigan at Trinity Lutheran in Monroe. It is just after 1 o'clock on Thursday, and we are in room 41. That is my list. So thank you all for coming and, seeing what on earth I'm talking about. So before we get started, if you'll join with me, we'll just pray together. Lord, thank you. Thank you for the blessing and the beauty of this day. Thank you that we might marvel at your creation, rejoice and celebrate in all the opportunities you've placed before us. Opportunity with friends and new acquaintances, opportunities to learn and to serve you, to grow your kingdom in whatever capacity and role you might have called us. Thank you. Be with us in our conversations today. It's in your name we pray. Amen. All right, so there's been this thing going on for a while. COVID-19. How many of you have heard of this? Okay, so doesn't matter where you're at in your stance on how to respond or don't want to respond, that's not what our conversation is about today. So if that's the conversation you'd like to have, looks like we need some seats. So, but there's a chance for us to talk to what does it look like as we come out of this, or how has the crisis of COVID-19 shifted the way we need to think about different aspects of ministry, whether it's school, whether it's church, whether it's parenting. All these different aspects were touched by a global pandemic. In everything we do, whether we wanted them to or not, it impacted them, it changed them, it altered things. So what were think back this time 2 years ago. What were some of the major shifts that happened for you all? Just to hear a couple examples. What were some of the major shifts? Streaming services. Why was that a major shift?
We weren't doing it before.
All right, you had to learn something new. All right? And then you actually had to learn how to tell people you're doing this. Okay? Ted, you had your hand up.
We moved, so we meet in the school. School's shut down, so we moved from the school to an outdoor beer garden.
All right. So for church planners, changing locations.
Yeah.
That's a massive thing to let people know where are we. Okay? Well, something you all.
We couldn't show people who we are. All we could do was tell them.
You couldn't show people, you had to just tell them who you were. What does that mean? Give me some illustration.
So I couldn't have a school admissions director. I couldn't have parents in the building. I couldn't give a feel of the family feel. You could say, hey, we love you, but you can't really get it.
You can't demonstrate it.
You can't demonstrate anything effectively this time 2 years ago.
You can't communicate what you want to communicate. There's a limit. There's a barrier. Okay? Something else. Maybe something very unique to your role. That's a very unique admissions director component.
So as an ed exec in South Wisconsin, working with 70 or 80 schools, between March and May especially, everything was happening so quick. There was stay-at-home orders, there was things like that, and I was trying to continue to resource my school leaders. So I felt like my job changed more to how do I filter the information that I'm hearing from state authorities, local authorities, and then put it out into a version that my principals and early childhood directors could easily understand.
So not only did you have to figure things out every day, because it changed every day, but you also had to figure out, how do I teach this to someone else? How do I explain it to someone else? Massively complicated. Anyone else want to share a major shift for them?
We have weekly face-to-face meetings with our executive team. We have, as I was saying to you earlier, we operate 4 schools in southeastern Wisconsin. And so we met every week. I have one-on-one meetings, and we have executive team meetings every week. And there was no face-to-face communication. So the entire shift of how we manage our business happened in a day.
Yep. No longer can you catch someone in the hallway. No longer can you sit down and talk. No longer can you just shoot the breeze with people. Kind of throughout the conversation, we'll talk about the element of the shift for we can do the formal communication. We can have those meetings. We can email people. We can tell them, yeah, we love you. Here's the information, the formal communication. But it's the informal stuff that we lost. It's the informal communication that then destroys the understanding of the formal stuff. So I'm going to see, Mia and I decided I'm just going to use the mouse. So we're going to hope the mouse didn't die. Have you ever heard of a saw pit? It actually was something that was started by the Romans as they conquered the world. That they would dig a pit, take a large log, lay it across. You'd have one person stand on top of the log and one person under the log. And you'd saw it into planks. Saw pit. Pretty straightforward, right? Whose job do you think was awful? The guy on top or the guy on bottom? The guy on top had to put more force and had to work harder. The guy on bottom had to deal with all the sawdust in his face and in his lungs, and so they had to switch roles regularly. They had to take turns. Something COVID's highlighted is something natural for our communication practices is that we take turns and we don't realize it. That formal communication. Here, I'm executive pastor. I'm going to sit down and meet with my administrative team. Here's our agenda. This is what we're going to talk about. But as I'm talking, as we're sharing, we're looking at highlighting, the school's doing this, the early childhood's doing this, church-wise, we've got this ministry coming up, things like that. But then noticing as we're talking about this new event that this member of the admin team is just looking distraught. And now we've shifted the conversation. Here's the agenda, but now we're dealing with whatever that might be. Maybe it's panic at they're planning something and it's just fallen to pot all around them and they just can't do it and they need our help. But now we've gone off script. The formal stuff has now given way to the informal. And it has to take turns. If you just spend time in the informal, you never get your other stuff done, right? If you're just always, well, how's your day today? Well, that's great. Didn't get anything done, but I know how everyone's day is. That's excellent. But it's that balance, it's that back and forth. So a saw pit, you can't just stay underneath and you can't just stay on top. One of you will burn out. So this is just kind of summing it up. COVID-19 had forced all of our churches, our schools, our RSOs, all the other ministry groups we have, from even radio, changes the way, how do we get together to record? How do we get together to talk? And we had to explore everything that we're communicating and how we do that. How many of you discovered something that you just assumed people knew, and you discovered during COVID they don't?
It was a question almost every week.
Exactly.
How did they not?
How did no one show up for this? How did no one call? How did no one whatever?
I mean, it was as simple as who our elders were.
Exactly.
Calling in and going, I need an elder to talk to. Who are they? And I'm like, didn't you know who they were 2 weeks ago when we met at church?
And the answer was no.
No.
They didn't. But you had to think through every step. And I love how you pointed out all the different mandates that came down or shifted and changed. It was daily. You had to alter things. And each time you altered something, you had to figure out, okay, so who do I have to tell what to? Right? And it was obnoxious and terrible and frustrating and all of those things. But how many of you built a new relationship with someone that you didn't necessarily have before because you just assumed they already knew stuff, but now you talked with them? All right. If you didn't, maybe check back. Look at who were some of those people you did start talking to that you didn't 2 years ago, that you hadn't been. All right, these are just some of the different things that we had to communicate inside our organization. Worship events. How do we communicate worship if you can't be together? What does that look like? How do we communicate worship if we're in a different location? Not just in the parking lot, but now we're at the bar. Like, for those of you who came in late, Ted went from a school to a bar having worship. So it was a legitimate example, okay? Maybe worship should be at a bar. I want to share, I have a plan for starting a restaurant and brewery in our town. This is going to be called Faith, Food, and Fermentation. It will be excellent. It will have worship services on Saturdays. If that happens, I invite you all. School functions. How many of you still had to have school even though you couldn't meet in the school? How many of you still had to figure out, how do we do athletics? How do we tell our incoming freshmen about this is what it looks like to do athletics in high school when I don't even know what it looks like to do athletics in high school anymore? All right? Different meetings. How many of you work with an assistant, or maybe you serve as an assistant, so you have to meet with an executive, educator or executive pastor or something like that? Just that kind of role back and forth, okay? Or you have to meet with just another staff member regularly. 2 years ago, how many of you would just stop by their desk? Hey, this thing came up, could you help me with? Or this thing you would ask me to work on, there's this challenge, how should I do it? How many of you had those conversations prior? Okay, then 2 years ago, all of a sudden, well, I need to talk to Tim about that. But I don't know if Tim's awake. I don't know if he has his computer or his phone, and we're not scheduled for a meeting for another 4 days. Well, shoot, that just changed how we set up any kind of conversation. Service projects. How many of you did any kind of service projects in your ministry whatsoever at any point in time? Okay, all right, so we know what a service project is. Those changed. Can you even do them? How do you do them? Do we have to wear a mask? Do we have to wear gloves? Can we be indoors? Do we have to do outdoors? Hey, it's 7 degrees outside. Do we still do it outdoors, or do we just cancel? Right? Changes everything. And I wrote 401 because that was where my list ended, of other miscellaneous things that we had to learn how to communicate differently. Okay? So I'm just curious, for you all, think 2 years ago, late February to early April. For those of you who worked more leaning towards church ministry, that was Holy Week. All right? What were some of the things that changed the most? I put a few things up here. I'm just curious to hear from some of you. What were a few things that changed the most from when most of the U.S. mandates came down in late February, early March, to that April? What were some of the biggest shifts for you all?
We started drive-through communion.
Okay. You had mentioned live streaming. I mean, that's a huge thing all on its own. And then how do we bring the gifts of God to people? Excellent. You had something.
Well, we didn't have live stream set up. So I was in charge of all the media stuff. So I had to coordinate with the pastors and the worship team to film everything. And then edit it and get it out, and how to make sure that it was a worshipful experience for everybody in a week's time, especially during Holy Week, where it was like Good Friday.
Yeah, it wasn't one
It
service.
was a lot. I didn't sleep much. But it was like, how do we get that feeling of that connection of worship with all pre-recorded stuff?
Yeah.
And then we finally were like, live stream is a thing now. But until then, we didn't have that. So it was a big learning
It's a
curve.
massive thing.
Our family feel went away, not because we didn't want it to be, but our members actually were upset with us. You haven't called me, and I'm in the hospital. You haven't done this, you haven't done that. Well, they didn't know how to communicate with us that a baby had been born.
Yeah.
Somebody had fallen, that, and it got put on our senior staff. Why don't you love me anymore? I mean, we were scrambling all the time of, did you hear? Did you hear? Well, oh, we got to get somebody out there. But our congregation didn't know how to come back to us and say,
Okay.
we're not seeing each other for 8 weeks. I have cancer.
The assumed communication things, people would just know this.
Right.
Well, how?
How? And
Yep.
they didn't know how to come back. And we didn't know how to.
Connect with them.
You have to talk to us too. So that was.
There was someone over here. Yeah.
We had to piggyback on that a little bit. Our communications to the congregation was a major struggle. We have elderly congregation at large. We have a lot of emails, some we don't. But just the ability to communicate with them. And then the difference, there was a lot of fear going on. And whether we're going to meet, some were adamant that we meet, some were adamant that we don't meet. So there was a lot of, one of the biggest changes I think we challenged with was working with the congregation to try and communicate to both groups effectively.
Yeah. So it's how do we communicate, and who do we communicate what to? I know that seems I'm going to get exactly back to that in just a few minutes. Les?
We had some of our congregation not being very techy, so once we started doing online, like it was, how do we make it as simple as possible for them to be able to join us? And then we also had a big debate on, for prayers, what do we publicize and
Yeah.
how do we publicize it? We put it on our website. Do we say names that get broadcast in our
Mhm.
recordings and go online? Instead of having it be just in the building, like, we're now going online where anybody and anybody can see it. So how much information do we share?
Do we include? Yeah. And I love your point, and it sounded like what you were hedging on too of, all right, we're going to do this tech stuff, but a big chunk of our audience doesn't know how to do it, and I can't teach it to them. I can't sit with everybody and say, all right, open up this browser, type in this word, click on this spot. All right? So this is coming from research I did in the fall of 2020. And it was Michigan pastors who are leaders of churches with K through 8 schools. So it was addressing both church ministry but also school ministry and activity. Things that came up, one of the biggest things was highlighting the role of how do we bring encouragement to people in a time where they're filled with fear, they're worried, should we do this, shouldn't we do this, or they're filled with anger and they're just mad at everything. How dare someone tell me this, or how dare someone tell me that, or I like this governor, I don't like this governor. We lived in Michigan. That was the primary conversation for most people.
Still is.
And it's, well, we're not talking about that. We're moving on. So the encouragement side of coming, how do you walk alongside someone, especially for, yes, I know there's someone in the room who will lean more towards the business side of ministry. That's your role, is the business part of it. For those of you who lean a little bit more on, I'm going to call it the pastoral care, but it's the care ministry side of stuff, was extremely hard because who needs to know they're loved and cared for? And the expectations went from, I'll see you on Sunday and you know my name, which gives me a sense of relief that if I need something, pastor knows who I am. Or the principal knows my kids. Or to now you don't have that interaction. So now no one knows me. No one cares about me. I don't have that touch point with each person. So that role of encouragement became massively complicated. The who and what. All right, so we have varied roles in the room. All right, for how many of you do pastoral, lead worship, pastoral responsibilities? Worship responsibilities, maybe your music, maybe your, okay? All right, we all need to know the readings. We need to know how are we going to worship, who's doing the sermon so that they have the right mic. We need to know who needs to get access to that. Well, the worship service, that's a massive audience. We're trying to get the worship service to everybody. Well, but I don't know how to get it to everybody because not everyone can open up their phone and pull it up. Not everyone knows how to go to this website or that website. How many of you work with smaller groups? Maybe it's youth or children, or it's an executive team, or it's an administrative office group, all right? Most of your conversations need to be had around this group. It's much more intimate, right? Not everybody needs to know everything. But the people who need to know don't need to know everything also. So if I need to talk to you about the meeting we're supposed to have next Thursday, how do I get the information to you? But I don't need to share the information with you because you have nothing to do with this. So now I have to have multiple streams of communication with multiple people for different purposes, and my brain's going to explode. And you got this person who wants to use Zoom, and this person who wants to use Google, and this person who wants to use FaceTime, and I don't even have an iPhone, so I can't do FaceTime. And that, all right? Does that sound familiar to any of you? All right. This comes back to the abilities and the willingness. I was absolutely amazed in the greatest way possible to see how many people stepped up and said, I will learn how to do this. I will learn how to edit video that I've never done before, to film video, to figure out how to have worship at a bar, and that willingness was huge. And you saw it across the board, especially that February, March, April of 2020. I think it fell off pretty shortly after that, but especially at the beginning, you saw a willingness to just figure it out. The ability side was the challenge, because not everybody knew how to do things. Some of the people I interviewed with, they worked in a circuit, and the local neighboring pastor said, I need your help setting this up. I want to start live streaming. Okay, so he was talking through it. His computer was 12 years old. I mean, he didn't even know how to open like a modern web browser. So the other pastor was like, you know what? I can't help you. I don't have the time to teach you all of these things. And that was a struggle. And that if you didn't have the ability, it became harder and harder to be willing to keep doing stuff. Then we get into the formal and the informal, which is kind of where we had started some of this conversation. The formal stuff, I can let you know information you need to know, but you have no context on why do I need to know this. Hey, we're going to have a virtual open house for school admissions. Okay, why do I need to know this? What does that look like? Why do I care? Who's going to be there? What am I going to talk about? Why did you tell me? Am I talking? Am I not talking? It's not like I can rub elbows with the 5th grader who's coming to check out stuff, right? So the formal and informal, you can't make connections with people. If you don't have the formal, you can't give a relationship on how you would extend information between one another. Hey, I know you. I know your schedule. I know your life. I know some of your struggles. We're not best buds. I don't know everything about you, but I know this is how you need to get the information. Well, if we don't ever spend time together, I can't learn that. I can't figure out what that looks like. So, across the board, we got really good at figuring out the formal communication stuff. Figuring out how do we distribute information. How do I get the most information to the most people? Hey, we had to learn what email address do I contact people with? What phone number? How many of you had a database for members or school families that was out of date? Okay? It's infuriating. Hey, I'm going to call Susie because I know she really wants to know this. Well, that number's been disconnected. Or someone else answers the phone and says, I'm sorry, this isn't Susie anymore. But we got good at figuring that stuff out. The lack of the informal stuff is what created a barrier to understanding all that information. Even think of worship. Is worship individualistic? Is it just you and Jesus? Good answer. Thank you. All right, you were all so hesitant. You're like, I don't know what I'm supposed to say. Pastor is going to yell at me. No, it's a community engagement. It's God and His people. It's not God and His person. It's a community. Well, now you take the community part out. Even when, for some of us, we couldn't worship in person or we elected not to worship in person, and then you got back to being in person, but you spaced out. You couldn't sit within so many feet of each other, or everyone wore a mask, or whatever the distinctions were. Or maybe you didn't have those things, but how many people weren't comfortable being there? All of a sudden, you've removed any of the community. You're still getting the goods. You still get Jesus' body and blood. You still hear the word proclaimed. You still receive those gifts. But you're not in a community anymore. You're no longer in a relationship. And that happened in the schools too. Hey, even the kids are here, but now the parents aren't allowed in the hallways. Or the parents are separated, or they stay in their car and they don't interact because you just send the kid out to the car so we don't have congregating of people. You've lost the community. You're still the organization, but you don't have the community. All those touch points that happen when you're in community no longer exist. That's the struggle. That was the hard thing that came out. Please, interrupt.
I was just going to add, so we're a school setting, and
Yeah.
Our culture and what actually is the reason people choose our school is because of the interactions that happen that aren't formal at all. Everything that we do is on an informal or cultural, just happens basis. What we're seeing now more than anything else is students lost 2 years of that skill.
Yeah.
And our teachers lost 2 years of trying to figure out how to invest in them and develop that. So it's the lingering effect of not having the informal pass in the hallway or just a conversation within the conversation. That's what creates a culture in most of our, at least at our Lutheran schools. That's where the actual, I don't want to say magic, but that's where the actual differentiator happens in Lutheran education.
It's what sets us apart.
Correct.
Yeah.
It's not the math. I mean, the math you can work out of any textbook, but that piece and losing that piece for such a long period of time
It's crippling.
is really hard.
Yes. And it's that, I love the word, the magic. It's what makes us different as Lutheran schools, but also as churches. I mean, you can have the guys that get together on a weekend and go bowling, or you can have the guys that get together on the weekend and have Rotary meetings. But what makes us different is we're a community. We love and care and connect with each other. Your hand went up.
I was going to say that, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
That, you know, in addition to the logistical changes, the practices that changed in our churches, there is also the controversy surrounding it that came from the culture into the church, I feel. Then when we were talking earlier about what were some of the big changes, to me that also created a division in the body of our church body.
All right.
You know, like in our
Yep.
vicinity, one church was doing this way, ignoring mandates, another was very strict about the mandates, and then all this political opinion about it, personal opinion, and personal experience, and that kind of
No, but that ends up causing more divide.
it came into the church more than I think it permeated the church more than other issues have in recent times.
And I would argue it permeated the church. So if you couldn't hear, she was saying not just the lack of the informal, but you also saw an increase in hostility, disagreement, division, struggle, things like that based on political reasons or cultural differences.
And, you know, just the whole issue about hearing with the mask on. You know, should I wear a mask? Shouldn't I wear a mask? I mean, I know people that stopped going to church because
Yep.
of all of that.
It caused major rifts. Now, that goes back to the lack of having the informal. All right, let's say, I don't know, what's your name in the back? Marlene? All right, so Marlene and I are friends. We've known each other for a while. We've known each other since she came in the door. All right? So Marlene and I are friends. There's some stuff that Marlene does that it's not what I would do, but she's a great person. I think it's whatever. That's fine. We're good. You know, we still get together. We still go to Ted's bar and have a beer, okay? So Marlene and I are still friends. And we're in a community. We see each other every Sunday. She's seen my kids grow up. We went out to a baseball game, you know, a bunch of people. It was great. Marlene and I are good friends. Now I haven't seen Marlene in 6 months. I know she's still connected to church. I see her log into the live stream. I know we were praying for Marlene's, you know, aunts, cousins, nephews, niece. And so I know we've been connected. She's still around, but we haven't really had a relationship. Now, I mean, okay, I'm gonna let's be real fun. I'm gonna show up to church and I'm not gonna wear a mask, but I'm gonna demand everyone be vaccinated and wear just left shoes. And that's what I showed up to church, and I am dead set. That's where I have developed my mentality. But I haven't seen Marlene in 6 months now. We have no relationship anymore. Marlene shows up and she's got a mask on, doesn't want anyone vaccinated, and she only wears purple right shoes. Okay? And she's dead set on that. Now all of a sudden we are in massive conflict in everything we do. We've lost our ability to be in a relationship because we have no informal connections. Yeah.
To piggyback on what Cole said, Cole looked at it from a corporate,
Uh-huh.
all schools perspective, right? If you look at it from the individual student perspective, they've lost 2 years of social, emotional learning that they
Yeah.
in the classroom, how to interact with others. If you take, my son was in kindergarten at the time this all, so from kindergarten really to second grade, it's not been
Normal.
quote
Yeah.
unquote normal. It's mask, it's this, and you're missing out on learning those cues. And what will there be any long-term impacts of this communication-wise? And if it affected our adults, like the way you just said, imagine how it's impacting
Our kids.
kids.
Yeah.
Still picking up these cues at such an early childhood.
That they don't even they don't have the background of Marlene and I were friends first. Our kids don't even know what that is to have a friend, or what it is to have that relationship where you may not agree all the time, and that's okay.
Actually, it shows up. I mean,
Oh, dramatically.
it's different, a little different. Our schools have actually, we only missed the 3 months. We have had school every single day since then, and our normal kids, our re-enrolled kids have had normal school, but now these outside families are finding us because of the magic, because of this relationship. Our problems are these kids that you're just talking about, who have been inside for 2 years, and we're actually getting what you're talking, this conflict between adults, between 6th graders and 5th graders.
Yeah.
And, I mean, no joke, it was as simple as,
Mm-hmm.
one kid thought he was gonna get punched.
Okay.
When somebody went like this, like, good job, and he went back like this, and they were like, okay, he is so weird. And I was like, he didn't know. what
They
it-
don't understand the cultural engagements.
Right, and so our kids are actually having that conflict, but in a different, they're not fighting over politics, but they're fighting
Although some
over-
of them do still.
Well, but it's the weird kid versus the,
Yeah, that's true.
so it does come in, it's crazy.
Yeah, and so when we come back, we look at the formal stuff. We learned how to get people's emails. We learned how to video edit, and that's a hard learning curve. We learned how to set up streaming stuff. How many of your groups used a phone tree? Like old school, we're going down, we're calling people. That was awesome. I mean, but even then we had to learn, we don't have the right phone numbers. Like no one has a landline anymore. And the only thing I've got is a landline for you all. Well,
Like caller ID, and I see you
oh yeah, they're like, oh, Pastor Potts, click.
Which kind of means, like I'm listening to you, that before COVID, there was no follow-up.
Either no follow-up, and I would argue the bigger
I
one,
mean, that may have been a problem.
but the bigger one was not that we didn't have follow-up, but it was, you told me on Sunday you're having surgery on Thursday, so I know about it. So I come to the hospital and I'm going to come check on you on Thursday or Friday, or I'm going to ask you on the next Sunday, did everything go okay? So I had the informal, you told me, I was next to you, I rubbed elbows with you, we interacted. Even as we were having our potluck meal, you were telling me this is upcoming. So there was that informal is what caused the ability to make up for not having the numbers or the emails or things like that. And what that led to is the lack of informal. We have no community. We have no magic. We have no family mentality. This was a quote from one of the guys I interviewed that he said, we were going through crisis together, but we were not together through the crisis. We're all experiencing it, but we're not in a relationship with anyone during any of it. All right, that's fun. We all commiserated together. Yes, we all agree. This was awful. Still is, still learning. So now what? What do we do with all of that? This seems ridiculously simple. Pray about it. Pray about how do I connect with the people that I don't get to see anymore. Pray about how do I connect with the parents of students that I haven't seen in the same way that I used to. Because they aren't wandering the halls. They aren't checking in with me. They aren't spending time with me. We were just talking about this. Update your records. All right, we made it through kind of the most dire part of it. We figured out how to get a hold of people. Now keep those records up to date. Because you still got to talk to them. You still got to get information. Let's say Ted just likes the bar. He wants to go from the middle school back to the bar. How does he tell everyone if he lost all their info? Okay, keep your records up to date. Familiarize yourself with new tools. How many of you had to learn how to use something new, technology-wise, over the last 2 years? All right? How many of you had to use a new social media platform? Okay? Or how many of you had to use a social media platform in a way you hadn't before? All right? That's probably more of us. I'm not saying we all have to be the experts at it. I'm not saying we all need to be the ones who are capable of, you know what, something happens, I will know exactly how to use the newest thing better than anybody. But we need to know what are the newest things. We need to be familiar with them. Not because that becomes our primary communication tool, but it may be our starting point communication tool. My friend and I, he lives in Nebraska now. We're both staying at an Airbnb together. And the last 2 days, our wives have just laughed at us. Because we're both on TikTok, not because we want to see, or we're on Instagram, we're watching Reels. Let's classify what we're doing. Looking for the dumbest things we can find so we can send it to each other and see if we can get the other one to laugh. Which is something we did at the seminary using a different social media thing. I'm much better at a straight face than he is. Just want to share. But you have to know how to use these tools because they might be the way you're communicating with people. You don't have to be the expert, but you have to know what they are. You can't just sit back and say, well, I don't like that new thing. Well, you may not, but you should know how it operates.
One thing that we've come across in one of the younger people on our staff, so technology is a little easier for me. But our one DCE, who's kind of our also office administrator, he'll come down to my office and he'll be like, okay, you need to put this in the dumbest, most simple way for me on how to do this, so when I get the phone calls, I can walk people through it. And I'm like, oh, you just do this, and he's like, no. You need me
It's too much.
3
Too much.
steps. You need to break it down to like,
Mm-hmm.
that's it. So that's been a big thing for me and the younger people who are in charge of all the technology and communications to be like, okay, how do I make this 1 to 2 steps? And that's it.
Yeah. So this, I would argue, can come out of this, but it's kind of a sidebar. How many of you saw younger generational people taking on more of a leadership role in your organizations out of necessity? They're the ones who knew how to use the tools. To some degree, did some of you see that? Yeah. That's,
And
Which-
they were allowed to be out. I mean, we lost a
oh yeah, a lot of our volunteers who,
in that time.
that
frame,
age group,
just said
yeah, I
our
can't be there.
Pantry that serves 500 people a week was staffed by retired volunteers.
Yeah.
And they weren't allowed to be in public. So guess what? We got 30 and 40-year-olds running in there
Yep.
because they're home with their kids.
Which is an awesome thing, and I pray we don't
Lose it.
lose it. Yeah.
Point out, I don't think there's anybody from our congregation here.
We won't tell.
We have an 86-year-old, she was 86 at that time, who has been absolutely against advancement in technology until COVID. Since then, and to this day, she continues to, bites at a time, want to continue learning.
Yeah, because she saw this kept me connected. I learned. I got to be a part of my family still, even though it's far away or stuck in my house.
And she's an administrator, I might add.
That's fantastic. All right, so this is kind of one of the big elements. We've lost the informal because we had to just do the formal. How do I figure out how to connect to everybody? So how do we reintroduce the informal? I know many of us are still in situations where there's hesitation or there's changes still from COVID or different conversations with that. I don't care. So, you got to find a way to connect with people anyway. All right, we're not comfortable being indoors in the same space together. Go outside. Hey, I'm not comfortable because I don't know people anymore. Buy name tags. You have to find a way to connect. Fine, Ted. No name tags.
No, we just started back our name tag.
Okay.
Well, and Dan, to
Please.
throw in on this, one thing we're learning, and so we planted in 2015, and so Dan and I were classmates. We were just talking about this. We were gangbusters. January 2020 was like, here's the momentum. We're going to get over the hump, and now we're kind of, in some ways, relaunching the church, and in some ways, it's been really healthy for us to go, hey, this is the best time for us to go, we had that thing in our system that we don't want to do anymore, and now we don't have to explain why we stopped doing it. But one thing our church was really good at pre-pandemic was just hanging out, like just getting together. And as you're talking about this, one thing I keep learning, and as you're talking about informal, is how simple it can be and how programmatic we want to make it, and how easy it is to just say, hey, our church is going to this restaurant at this time, whoever wants to come.
Yeah.
Like that has been an incredible blessing of saying, we'll want to take those 4 points and program out how do we make those 4 points happen. And you're going to be the awkward person sticking your face going, hi, to everybody, right? Because I have to say hi.
Mm-hmm.
But as you talk about informal communication, what I really like what you're saying is like, it's the simple stuff. It doesn't have to be overly programmatic. That's the stuff we got to worry about with how our newsletter's going out.
Yep. How do we get info out?
Right. But
Great.
This is like, who's the person at church I haven't seen in a while that I love that I haven't had coffee with lately?
Mm-hmm.
And
Or how many of you at church greet one another? I know that was a simple question. How many of you greet each other at church?
That's been the best
Okay.
thing about COVID is we stopped doing that.
All right. So there is a subset of our community. There's a subset of our community who's like, I want to come to church and worship
I'm an extrovert, I still.
and I don't want to talk to anybody. I'm sorry, you're not going to like what I have to say next. The greeting people is something amazingly simple, but it all of a sudden builds a relationship with someone in an informal way. One of the things I started doing at church, and you can laugh at me, that's fine. So we were still in a period where, we had a lot of people wearing masks or still really separated. So we weren't going to, go up and shake hands with each other, get in each other's faces, give a hug, things like that. So this was what I'd have to tell everyone. All right, so listen all the way through before you move. Don't move yet. But I'm going to have you get up. Because then you'd always have one or two people who stood up. And I said, you moved too soon. Sit back down. You're going to get up. You're going to look around. You're going to make eye contact with someone. Again, you've got masks on a lot of people so they can't see faces. You make eye contact with someone. And then I give them something. And you're going to tell them, it is great to see you today. So you have them stand up and they're looking. They're making eye contact with people on the balcony. It's great to see you today. It was awesome. And then you get a little bit more goofy because it's fun and why not? And church should be a fun place to be, just FYI. All right, you're going to stand up, you're going to make eye contact with someone, and you're going to tell them, you look lovely this evening. And you watch these, 70-year-old guys stand up. And they'd find the other 70-year-old guy, you look lovely this evening. And they do it. And it was building a community, and people could chuckle and laugh. And all of a sudden it went from we go and we do and we check our box off and we leave, to now all of a sudden I'm at least connected to you. If for no other reason than we laugh together. So those simple, you got to do something to have some fun. If it's in worship, if it's in school, if it's going out to dinner, if it's having beer, if it's instituting a potluck in the parking lot. How many of you talked to a friend or a family member who struggled a lot during any period of lockdown? Extremely lonely. How many of you talked to people who were incredibly anxious? Yeah. How many of you experienced you can't really quite distinguish it, but you're anxious just because? Yeah. You feel like your heart's racing and you're just trying to decide which cereal do I want. Okay? Listen to each other. That goes, maybe as Ted pointed out, who's the person I haven't seen in a bit, have lunch together, have coffee together, and just listen. Maybe I'm going to give them a call. I finally got everyone's number. I'm going to call them. I'm going to text them. I'm going to see what's going on. I'm going to use those new social media tools, and I'm going to listen.
I volunteered at a congregation, not my own, during the beginning of COVID, and they made an assessment form. and they trained volunteers, and what we did is we called every member of the congregation to go through a series of questions, in an informal,
Yeah.
friendly, casual
Conversation.
conversation to assess how they were doing. Did they have needs? Did they have need for food?
Mhm.
Especially the elderly, were they getting to the grocery store? Did they have other needs that they wanted to express? And, we just got varied answers when we talked to different people. Some people were like, thanks for calling, I'm doing fine,
Mhm.
And others really had actual
Other people talked for 45 minutes.
social,
Yeah.
spiritual needs. And so then we would go through that and we prayed with everybody at the end.
It's fantastic.
Some of the people were like, I'm elderly, and one person called me, and I said, I can't get to the store and I need hearing aid batteries. So they went to Costco and bought, because I go to Costco, they're cheaper. So they actually made a run to, this was the very beginning of
Nice.
COVID, and bought batteries for me.
So you're engaging with
So
people.
I think that's
Yep.
an informal way that even today, I don't know, because I'm not.
Why would we get rid of something like that? Yeah. How do we keep in touch with each other? I think it's an awesome idea. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
All right, so this is the fun part of any of you who feels like there's a Lutheran conference, so we need to have some Luther in it. All right, small called articles, part 4, the gospel, part 1. We will now return to the gospel, which not merely in one way gives us counsel and aid against sin, for God is super abundantly rich and liberal in his grace and goodness. First, through the spoken word, by which the forgiveness of sins is preached, he commands to be preached in the whole world, which is the peculiar office of the gospel. Secondly, through baptism. Thirdly, through the holy sacrament of the altar. Fourthly, through the power of the keys. And also through the mutual conversation and consolation of the brethren. All right, so it's not just me telling you go hang out and spend time together. Luther did a long time ago, and he connected it to the proclamation of the gospel. That is, when you're in those informal relationships, when you're in the informal togetherness, is when you get to bear living out the gospel. Is when you actually get to have that intimate, maybe it's that private back and forth with one another, hearing that love of Christ proclaimed. But that comes not always just in that simple, Jesus loves you and died for you, but it's also he loved and died for me too, and we're in this together. He's called us to be his people. I love this conversation with the brethren. It's not just to sit and be talked to, but it's to engage with one another. So, the informal stuff, the saw pit, you can't just have the formal. That has to work really hard. And listening to you all worked really hard. How do I get information to people? How do I enable people to worship when they can't be in the building? How do I get new parents connected with the school? How do I organize multiple schools in a whole new setting? All right? You all had to work really hard. And that was a lot. But you also have to go to the other end. And now you're going to have to deal with getting all the sawdust in your face. Because when you actually interact with people is when it gets messy and dirty and complicated. But that's important, because if you don't have that part, you can't do the other part efficiently. Okay? So, ta-da. All right, so what are things that came up that challenged you or brought up questions? Cole, you had...
Yeah, so I actually just a comment
Please.
question at the end of this. So you talk about restarting the informal communication, which is the basis of these relationships.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote in my notes, we at our association, and we're just in the process of doing this now because could be dangerous, but we're drawing a line in the sand and saying, we're not talking about COVID as all of the things that it's inhibiting us to do now. Even though there are still things that, as things spike, it might change that. But if we don't ever move beyond this, and we don't say, what are we doing now? Okay, the world has changed a bit. Now what does it look like? What are we doing to grow and thrive and interact with one another and have that mindset to grow God's kingdom? I mean, it's so easy. Just turn on the news, and the media is doing such an amazing job of making us feel horrible about what's going on out there and being afraid and, being complainers and negative. Like it's, like I, for about 9 months, I didn't even watch the news because it's just so depressing.
I still don't.
Yeah.
I'm.
And so I just think, I think at some point in time, again, you can't be reckless about it, but you have to go, we have to get back to community. We have to get back to doing what's important to our schools, for our kids, for whatever ministry you're
Yep.
in. And stop talking about, well, this post-COVID or post-pandemic. Like, yeah, the world changed. The world doesn't just change with the pandemic. The world changed when this thing came into,
Yep.
into existence. The world changes all the time.
Yeah.
And will continue to
And will
change.
continue, just at a rapid rate. So it gives us if we're gonna be ahead of it, it's gonna give us a great opportunity to invest in and build relationships with people differently than we have and stronger than we have.
And I love differently, because we used to always rely on this way, because this is how we did it. Then we had to stop, and we got that chance to analyze, do we really want to keep doing that? Ted, you brought that up about your worship, your group, your structure. We had to stop. Do we really want to go back to doing it this or doing that? And we get to do the same thing now. It's an opportunity to say, this is important, not post-COVID. This is just important. So what does that look like? What do we do? Please.
Again, I'll continue to piggyback off Paul because, that's easy to do. He's got good ideas. But in the same light, I hate hearing the words, we need to return to normal.
Normal's gone.
I don't want to go back to normal because normal wasn't great for everybody.
Yeah.
Going back to what it was in February of 2020, there are plenty of people that would say, well, February 2020 really kind of sucked for
And it's
me and my people.
impossible, it's impossible anyway. We can't go back to that.
No, I'm with you. Let's go back. We're done. We're done. It's time to move forward. What are we gonna do now?
Yeah, there's a lot of, it's easy for us to get caught up in the negatives of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of blessings that came about as a result of COVID.
Oh yeah.
If we actually take the time, as, you all are much more professional communicators than I am, but we all have it's part of our roles. It's so easy to focus on the negative side of what's happened over the last 2 years that if we spend some time looking at some of the silver linings that came about as a result of this,
Yeah.
it do us all good.
So one of the things I did, again, people were afraid, people were hesitant, so I started doing a nightly devotion. And because it's me, I did it in my pajamas. And so it was Potts' PJ devotions, all right? It was every night, 8 o'clock, every night but Saturday and Sunday. And I did it for just shy of 2 years. I stopped during Advent because we lost the other pastor and I don't have time. And I got 4 kids. I was like, I'm exhausted. But just something simple, and something that came out of that was the connections with people who hadn't been a part of our church since they went to school in the 8th grade, that now are intimately connected because of a simple little let's pray together at night like mom and dad used to do when I was a kid. It's an awesome thing. Ted, what do you got?
Dan, so you've done this research, you've looked into it. As you look at informal, just use the force line. As you look at informal communication and as you hinted at, part of what happened is that informality overcame disagreement. Coming out backwards of that, how do you see, because it seems to me, experiences I've had, what I've seen around is that people are not giving time for informal if they disagree with you now. So have you seen how that works?
Yeah, and the few instances I've seen of that element of successfully re-engaging in informal even when you're in disagreement is on the most basic starting point. You don't start with, I hear Trump's running again, I'm so excited. All right, that's a pretty divisive statement. Doesn't matter which end, that's going to cause a dividing line. But to talk about, I love that my kids get to play at the park, isn't this great? Or, the new restaurant, we just got a Culver's in Monroe because we're big stuff now. All right, hey, Culver's is open up. Have you gone there yet? You may be diametrically opposed to me in almost everything, but it's still something new and exciting for the community. Can we talk about it? So it's that the informal, even when there's division, if it starts at the most basic point, allows the buildup. Exactly.
Pretty much good. So.
Ice cream and churros. That's why we're here this week, right? All right. What do?
I want the pretzels, by the way.
Okay.
But one thing that we've struggled with, and I don't know if anybody else has suggestions or has had to struggle with, we've seen our online, we never did online before, and we've really seen it grow. And there have been times where I've said to, we have our pastor and our DC who have been there for years, so, everybody knows them. And I'm like, not everybody online knows who you are. We know we have people who are watching our services who we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've said to them, I was like, you have to introduce yourself every service. And they're like, but no, everybody knows me. I was like, no, you don't. Like, how are people doing that? How are they doing the informal things and making sure people at least feel connected to, whoever's making the announcements or doing the sermon? How are you doing that online?
Yeah. So, and I'm not saying we do this very well. I know there are probably a lot of you in this room that do it better. One of them would be when you're streaming is that to have a person who's managing the stream, not, hey, I press play and I'm making sure the camera, but is engaged. Hey, Susie's here. Susie, it's great that you could join us. It's that informal, I'm making a touch point. I also would encourage to, especially if they're local people that are tapping into that, is to give them that opportunity to connect. Hey, I know many of you worship online and we love having you there. We're going to have our online group, we're going to meet at Pizza Hut because I like pizza. Just give that opportunity. You may only have 3 people come, but if that's 3 people who then connect with the rest of the community, then your community is growing still. But yeah, I think having someone that's their role during worship is to engage with people. That's a big step. Yeah. All right.
Well, I was just saying, even if they don't introduce themselves, have a lower third or something on the screen. 'Cause if they feel funky at the bottom of the screen, introducing themselves every week, at least there's that acknowledgement of, hey, this is the senior pastor or this is the children's ministry person. Because sometimes you tell them 3 times before they start the service and they forget.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, have you seen that, the banner stream across that would just, Pastor Daniel Potts. Ta-da. And it's there, even though I may not say, hi, I'm Daniel. But it's at least to our online audience, they see this is who that person is.
Trying to get them to eye contact with you.
Yeah, which as a pastor was a hard thing to get used to.
Awkward thing
Yeah.
to do because your camera's over the heads of everyone else.
Which actually, when everything was shut down and we didn't have people in person, was much easier. Because it was just a camera and me. It's like, hey, buddy. It was good.
He'd have his assistants next to him, and he would sit there and he'd talk to them because they were the only people in the room when we recorded. So we finally said, no, you cannot sit up there. You have to go out and sit behind the camera.
Yeah.
So he looked at the camera because he had to talk to a person.
You had some.
This is more of a next step question.
Okay, please. Please.
We're not, do you need more? Okay.
Go.
So we did the ways to connect, the fun for their high listen. And I didn't realize till you were talking about this, and then our early education director and our principal actually stand outside the school every single day and they say hi to the students who get dropped off or walked in. And I didn't think it was a really big deal until we did Valentine's for the staff and asked our parents and kids to write in on Google Doc, and we dropped it off to our team. And no joke, there were 40 responses about, I love that you're there in the morning to say hi to us, and then you say this. I'm like, it's...
So we have a day school, and I'm out there every day, in the snow, in the rain, and it's fantastic.
And I didn't, but then it's a way to connect, which I'm like, okay, she rocks, she's on it. What's the next step? I mean, what do we go now from these 4?
So what's our goal? What's our function? And I would argue, and you can disagree, I don't know that you should, but you can.
Your team
ultimate goal is that people would come to know Jesus,
Okay.
right? That's doesn't matter if we're school administrator, if we're a church, if we're
Do
all
we
right.
keep it informal to this next, so the.
Okay.
Do we go formal at this point, or do we keep the informal to a certain level?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, no, the informal doesn't stop.
Okay.
The informal's the perpetual relationship sign.
Settle the balance, because it's obviously very informal. at
Yeah,
this point.
it's so like the example of someone greeting people in the mornings. I am the pastor for several families that have never stepped foot in our church
Right.
because I greet their kids and I know their parents' names.
Right.
That's just an ongoing, perpetual thing. And when I hear, they're having a baby, hey, they got sick, hey, now it's now I'm on
Yes.
to call, to check, to care.
Okay.
So it's the same, like for those
Yeah.
leaders in your school, it's that, so now follow up. You've got the relationship. It's evidenced.
Right.
We saw it last week.
Yes.
Capitalize on
Right,
it.
that's where, it was already in my mind. How do we?
Yep, it's that,
The next hurdle.
it's that now it's not just me saying good morning to your kid as they get dropped off. It's me sending you an email of just, hey, Smith family, I was praying for you all this week, or you're on my list to pray for this week. What can I be praying for you?
Okay.
It's an invitation to engage in a deeper relationship. It may not move beyond that informal, I know your kid and your kid knows me. But I got to try to engage some way. And that goes, I think Ted said, the programmatic. The informal needs to be there, but it's not necessarily, here's all the steps. It's just you're living alongside of them. Your hand had been up several different times.
Bigger picture, I agree with this young man here in front of me about don't want to go back to normal.
Mm-hmm.
I think God didn't create the COVID, but with pain, there's tremendous gain, not just with the technology, but we stopped the treadmill of everything's fine. It wasn't fine.
Yeah.
We weren't getting more Christians. We weren't spreading the story. I think I go to a church where our early learning center shut down for 6 weeks. It came back with vengeance. We flourished. We're
Yeah.
on a major expansion. We have waiting lists trying to get in for 1, 2, 3, and 4-year-olds.
Ours too.
We
Same.
at our staff, the mission field came into the school that we had. We don't have to leave the property of the church, but it's coming to us. We're equipping. We don't have all the Lutheran teachers, but we're equipping the early learning center. It's hard to get staff.
Yes.
It's a great opportunity, and they all have families.
Mm-hmm.
It was incredible Advent services, and we had 270 parents and kids in our church with no members there because we didn't have room to listen for 10 minutes. But sharing Jesus, that's the bigger.
That's why we exist,
The
right?
opportunity is so much in front of you guys that are younger here. My time's limited, but I think the pandemic is one of those reset opportunities. Take
I
it,
agree.
run with it.
I agree.
The old rules have been shattered. Keep doing what you're talking about here.
You mentioned something that triggered for me. You said you greet the kids by name.
Uh-huh.
Do you know the names of the parents? Because knowing somebody's name is a huge part of informal communication. And to know that, I'm an intentional interim pastor.
Okay.
And I'm working in a congregation where they literally shut down for over a year, except for the school, and did nothing because the pastor cloistered off. He was so scared of the pandemic and so on. And now working with them, I find out that the Board of Elders, they've got their little church. They divided up the congregation into elder groups, if you will. Mostly is where they call. Here they call them little churches. The elders didn't know necessarily the names of the people in their church, their little church, or their spouses' names, or their kids' names.
That's surprising.
Is okay. Isn't it about time you start learning names?
Yeah.
Because if you can't talk to somebody and say their name, what kind of communication necessarily is that? And so, you greet the kids at the door, that say their name, and before the parent leaves away, Bob, have a good day at work. Or Jane, you know the parent. That's an added level of contact than just saying hi, informal.
Yeah, but it's still just saying hi. Like, oh, hi, John. Hi, Joe.
Yeah, yeah.
All right.
It takes some effort to learn.
Oh, yeah. It's not easy all the time. All right. I just want to take a moment. Thank you all for being here. I know we still got a lot of time, but I am really hot in this room. And I'm missing the 5 degrees in Michigan. See? So we're good to go. So thank you all. If you got some other questions, I'll hang out. I really appreciate you being here. I pray you have a great couple days, that you learn, that you grow.